Well, hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking about a relational model, a treatment program relational model, and 8 aspects of any program in terms of the principles ought to have if they consider themselves a relational based program. Certainly in wilderness therapy, these 8 aspects should be in place in order for that program to be operating as a relational based program. To define relational, I'll just talk about that just for a little while. So, relational as opposed to behavioral, these are two sort of distinct main roads people go down when operating in the world of treatment, mental health treatment, emotional health treatment, even addiction treatment. There are behavioral techniques and there are relational techniques. There's other techniques as well, but people often see these as sort of a dichotomy, relational over here and behavioral over here. I have spoken about relational versus behavioral in other podcasts, so other video podcasts. So go see my other 10 and you'll see intermixed along the way different comments and points of view and ideas and concepts about the relational model. Today, I want to sort of pick it apart and talk about 8 very important pieces of a relational model. And in my opinion, if a program doesn't have all 8 of them in some form, they are less than completely relational as a model, and they probably lean more towards pieces that are in the behavioral realm. And sometimes without even knowing it, by the way, it is hard to run I'll say, as pure a relational model as you can. Because it's a lot easier just to get people to do what you want them to do by creating carrots or sticks, even if those are very subtle and appropriate in the realm of treatment. They're still behavioral. Keep in mind, 20, 30 years ago, what people did that they thought was appropriate in behavioral programs nowadays would be looked very much down upon and don't fit at all. And people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe treatment was like that back then. But that's when we just understood different things. And so, of course, we're not going to go back to those days. Well, I was there in those days 30 years ago, and I remember thinking with other people who understood the relational model, what in the world are they doing over there at such and such a program, at this other program, with these behavioral techniques? It's easier to control people. It's easier to sort of demonstrate that you've affected their behavior if you're using behavioral means. Sometimes these things have been called even behavioral negotiators. So, for example, some wilderness therapy programs literally have that in their literature, or used to. Behavioral negotiators were certain good parts of food, for example, and if kids comported themselves well, then they got particular kinds of food. If they didn't, well, then they didn't. Well, you're going to shape a group around by using these sort of tools. Well, a relational model doesn't use those tools. Now, it makes it more difficult because what you're left with is working person to person. So I'm going to go through what I mean by person to person is a person trying to entreat another person to perhaps change their viewpoints or their behavior, their way of being. We've talked a lot about way of being. And by the way of being comes first. If there's my way of being going along, my behavior follows that. If my way of being changes, my behavior will follow my way of being. So to effectuate change in somebody that is genuine and long-lasting, what you're wanting to do is affect their way of being. And you can only do that through a relational model. And now sometimes when behavioral models are successful, it's because embedded within that behavioral model, there were individuals, practitioners, therapists, line staff, or whatever, that were doing relational things. Every time, by the way, my humble opinion. So I will go through these 8 aspects of a relational model in a treatment program. Number 1, relationship driven. So that probably seems pretty obvious that that would be part of a relational model. I'm going to read a sentence from a book by Jeremy Safran and Christopher Moran called Negotiating the Therapeutic Alliance, a Relational Treatment Guide. They reference a long study that was done. I'll just read this. A half century of psychotherapy research has shown that the quality of the therapeutic alliance is the most robust predictor of treatment success. 50 years. That's a long time. So that's a study that has been going on since I was 1 year old, 2 years old. That's a long time to be studying kind of the same thing. And the idea is, what are the predictors of therapeutic success? What are all of the pieces of treatment wherein you can help perhaps get the best kind of change the most efficiently or whatever? Well, they found out across 50 years that the most robust predictor of treatment success was the therapeutic alliance. What's the therapeutic alliance? It's just the relationship between the two people. In other words, a patient cares less about the tools you're using with them and is affected less by the tools you're using with them and what you're doing with them than how you feel about them, how they feel about you, whether or not they feel that you appreciate them or recognize them as a person, whether or not they are seen by you as a person. The relational aspects of the treatment are number one, most important. What boggles my mind is, notwithstanding that proof that has gone on, people will still lean way off towards the behavioral side. And I've talked with folks, they've been quite honest. Shayne, it's really hard to run a program purely relational. Do you know how well you'd have to know all of your students in the program to run a purely relational model all the time? And my response has been, well, that's the point. You have to know them. You have to see them. So piece number 1 of 8 of a relational model for a treatment program is that it is relationship driven. The biggest piece of the training philosophy, concepts, things that are sort of the flag waving in the program is relational driven. The best way to help staff as a whole be relational to students as a whole is to help staff understand what it means to see students as people to respect given their innate humanness, as people to see as equals, as people to see as innately important and valuable. What I have found to help people, staff, all practitioners understand that idea comes mostly from the Arbinger Institute. So look that up, Arbinger, like harbinger, like hard-hearted harbinger of haggis, but without the H, Arbinger. What I have learned over time from the Arbinger Institute and other places as well, different cultures have had this idea of contemplating that you can see people as people, or you can see them as objects, you can see them as sort of not human, or you completely humanize them to you. Arbinger and all of their work. Terry Warner, who's the original founder of Arbinger, and his book Bonds That Make Us Free, being sort of the centerpiece of that. So training, philosophy, the centerpiece of everything that's done in the program is about relationship. And so find a really good vehicle. People who run a program need to find a really good vehicle to train that, to get that across to everybody across the board all the time. So Arbinger is one of those. Understanding in terms of Taoism, and another piece that I've been into for a long time, some of you know that I've written a book about it, is whether or not you're following the way, the Tao. while interacting with another person, as opposed to not following the way while interacting with another person. In the box, out of the box. Not following the Tao, following the Tao. Seeing a person as not an object but a person. Being I, thou towards a person as opposed to I, it towards a person. There are a lot of terms for it. And if it's central, then everybody in the program can start moving this idea continually out to the students that come. Because it is the most robust predictor of treatment success. More so than sophistication of clinical apparatuses. More than all of it. The second thing is that a program should be non-punitive and non-consequencing. Now, to be clear, what I mean by that is almost entirely non-punitive and non-consequencing. So, piece of a relational model treatment program, the second piece that needs to be in place, we have relationship driven, now non-punitive, non-consequencing. So a non-punitive, non-consequencing program is one in which doling out consequences is the absolute last option. And the only way to make it the last option is to sort of disallow it. I am not saying to all parents or people that are listening to this that we are not allowed to consequence our children, our students, our clients in a program, but unless you are emotionally serene, unoffended, unbothered, unhurt at the time that you come up with a consequence, it will be an effort based on what's going on with you and not what is going on with them. Pure and simple. No way around that. I've mentioned this in other video podcasts, but I've done presentations of room full of therapists, and I ask them, have you ever consequenced a kid in a treatment program while being emotionally serene? Not upset, not annoyed, not upset for somebody else, anything like that. Well, usually nobody raises their hand. And then how likely is it, I ask that you're going to consequence somebody while you're upset at them? And how many of you have done that? Every hand goes up. So non-punitive, non-consequencing program is focused on the client's way of being and how to affect it through relationship, not external behavioral means. So if we are consequencing clients in our program, then we're operating under the theory that it takes external stimuli to get them to change. If we don't do a lot of consequencing, but instead we focus on our relationship, way of being, then what that means is we're allowing on, we're leaning on, we're hoping that our influence can go into them. So from in out is their behavior as opposed to from out in. So the third aspect of a relational model in a treatment program of any kind would be this concept of engaging agency. I have done a full video podcast. In fact, it was the last one I did solely based on that subject. It's about an hour long, so I am not going to talk very much at all at this time about engaging agency, other than to say I can either get somebody, get them to change or to behave differently, or I can figure out how to get them or to invite them to choose me as a mentor. So go, and there's ways that I can do that. There's things that I can implement in myself that make it easier for me to engage another human being's agency in positive ways. So go to that episode called Engaging Agency. That's the third thing. The fourth thing, acknowledging internal change. Okay, so there is a big difference between acknowledging external change and acknowledging internal change. So if you have a mechanism that acknowledges external change, usually what that looks like is a level system of some kind, or a battery of rules that are to be followed, and then when people follow those, they get some sort of recognition, or they get sort of privileges, or something that to them is enticing in an external way. Extra ice cream, would be a good example. Or in wilderness therapy, I get to have a modern Crazy Creek chair, or I get to have a flashlight, or I get to just have some kind of privilege that nobody else has. So acknowledging internal change is more about looking for opportunities to notice changes that are coming from the inside of them. And one of the best ways to be able to accomplish that is to not have external things that are enumerated to them that they have to accomplish. So if they don't have a lot of things that they have to accomplish, but they are going through the system of the program basically sort of naturally, and then changes come about, then observe those, and acknowledge those in the most powerful way you possibly can. A lot of programs have different kinds of ceremonial pieces to them. Wilderness therapy is big on ceremony. Residential type programs can have it too. But ceremonial times, times wherein you acknowledge people in a formal way, it's not an award, it's an acknowledgement. Awards come from people knowing what they may be a competition, or what they know they need to accomplish, and they accomplish, and they get awarded for that. Acknowledging internal change is simply noticing that they are making these cool changes, that the evidence of which has more of this idea of having come from inside of them. So if you have a young lady who comes to a program, it could be a young man as well, and they suffer with depression, and their eyes are down, and they're quiet, and they're just sort of sullen. Somewhere along the way, they become happier, they become brighter, they are standing up more straight, they're maybe even cheering somebody else up. They didn't read a book, or they didn't read sort of a handbook or a rule that they had to follow. Always cheer people up. No, it just came from inside of them. Well, a program that is relational will come up with a system that will acknowledge that will notice it and acknowledge it. Not only that will show it, that will demonstrate it through the staff, that will add it to the sorts of things that people in the program are teaching. So it's all sort of this, influence is just sort of emanating towards the group of clients, and then what sets fire in them begins to show, and then you acknowledge it. Some wilderness therapy programs have little medallions or pendants or tokens or little items that are given as an acknowledgement, for example. Okay, so acknowledging internal change has to be this piece of a relational program. There is a study called Broaden and Build theory. Fredrickson is the person who did 2002, who did this study. That's the last name, Fredrickson. And this Broaden and Build, basically they showed that if you do acknowledge internal change that's just coming from the person, that helps them build on it, and they'll generalize and broaden from just the thing that you've acknowledged, and they'll build on it. And it has sort of this exponential kind of quality to it in terms of them feeling really good about being acknowledged in a way that was just natural to them, and so they want to do it more. So there you go. This acknowledging internal change kind of flows over into no level system. Almost every treatment program in the country operates with a level system. There are a lot of amazing, powerful, high-quality programs that use a level system. In my opinion, they would just be better and higher quality programs if they figured out a way to not have a level system, or at least not have a level system that's so much based on behavior. So here's the deal. In a residential or any kind of treatment program, you have two things that are being watched. The clinical progress of a client, and that often is what the therapists are kind of observing for, or that's the kind of thing that they talk about in their sessions. And then over here you have behavioral actions that are going on. Now, often the clinical path that I'll talk about teenagers. The clinical path that a teenager might be going on might be working on their trauma, for example. But over here, well, they have to make their bed. And if they don't make their bed, they can't have breakfast. Or the whole floor can't have breakfast. Or the whole group can't have breakfast until all the beds are made. And they get hooked into this thing about making a bed. It might be that their mother whipped them because they didn't make their bed. And they actually have trauma around this idea of making a bed. Well, if it's all about their physical behavior that we want to see during the day, we literally don't care about why they're not making the bed. They just have to make the bed. And there will be things put in place that will make sure they make their bed. It's interesting. I had a residential staff tell me a little story, and this person was familiar with some of these concepts. He said, I was talking to the client. The client hadn't made her bed for a long time, and she wasn't going up the levels, and everybody just would kind of get into a kerfuffle with her about her making her bed. And he realized, I haven't talked to her about why she's not making her bed. And she had evidence to show that if you make your bed, you have there's more bugs that can get in there or whatever. In her mind, it was a dirtier thing to make the bed and contain things that might be in your bed as opposed to leaving it undone. And so he said, well, what would be your way of sort of getting on board with the spirit of the idea of making your bed while being comfortable with this idea that the sun is, clearing your sheets out, or, whatever it is that she would, felt pretty important, that she felt was rather important. So she said, well, I can fold up my blankets and I can fold this sheet up and I can, lay them out where it looks nice, but it's not made in a traditional way. And he said, great, that sounds really good. And she did that. That was her way of making the bed, and she did it every single day on time from there forward. So that's an example. What's more important, that the lights are out at 10 or that they're out at 10:05 and we haven't restrained a kid because they wouldn't turn the light off? True story, by the way. So a level system is where your behavior is operating in a way that the program has laid out that you need to be doing. Perhaps on the first level system, the first level, you obey all those things, you get done with that, and you don't have to wear orange pants anymore, which is the identification of you as only being on level 1, for example, stuff like that. So at some point, you get privileges having to do with being able to use phones or whatever. So a non-level system, again, it takes away from the outside in influence, external, extrinsically motivating all of these clients, and it makes it more about what's going on in their life, which typically is the clinical path anyway. Each child comes as an individual. So if there's 10 kids in a group in wilderness therapy, for example, 9, 10, whatever, there are, we'll say 10, if there's 10 kids in a group, there's 10 tracks, there's 10 treatment plans, there's 10 directions, there's 10 journeys going on. Why would you create this level system that basically is a representation of the journey that they're expected to take, all 10 of them, one journey? Well, there's a little bit of this clinical, sort of track that's going on well, in the treatment plan, but gosh dang it, they also have to do this, just like everybody else. That is less individualized, and in my opinion, it is less clinically sophisticated. But if you take this away, and it's all about the treatment plan and how they're moving along as an individual without a level system, you tend to cut through what they commonly are resistant to. If you show too manipulative kids clearly what they need to do in order to show that they're progressing, they'll do those things. So they don't necessarily resist doing the behavior that you're asking them to do in the level system. Some of them get right on board with that, because for them, hey, tell me the hoop to jump through, and I'll jump through that sucker so that I'm showing you that I'm doing it. Malicious compliance sometimes is referred to that idea. I'm obeying. In a different video podcast that I made, I told a story about a little 4-year-old girl that said, "I'll sit down, Mommy, but I'm standing up on the inside." If you want to know the rest of that story, go watch my other episodes. Okay, so no level system. So far, to recap, we have talked about, in terms of a relational model, the 8 aspects that a program that professes to have a relational model should have. 1, it's relationship driven. Another, it's non-punitive, non-consequencing. Another, it engages agency, acknowledges internal change, and doesn't have a level system. Again, just to kind of emphasize, a program that doesn't have all of those 100%, I'm not trying to say it's a bad program. I'm just saying that optimally, it would be the case that a program to be relational would have those 5 things and 3 more. I'm going to get to those. Clinically centered. Okay, so a lot of programs out there talk about being clinically centered. Typically, what they mean by that is that the professionals, the therapists who work directly with the client, are clinically sophisticated, do clinically sophisticated things, have are talented clinically speaking, or use a lot of different modalities in terms of therapeutic techniques, or what they do in actual therapeutic sessions, or the group sessions, individual sessions. They have, different sort of approaches in their personal interactions and practices with the clients. And in residential situations, it's a little bit easier to do that because the professional staff are on site typically all the time, just like all of the line staff, the normal day-to-day staff. They're not necessarily interacting with all the clients all the time, but at least they're in the building and they see them. They may see the kiddos from their caseload every day or a few times a week or something like that. In wilderness, it's different because the therapists aren't around as much, so there's a lot of reliance on the program itself, meaning everything that happens besides the therapeutic sessions themselves. So that's the point I'm making here. A clinically centered program concentrates on the quality of the program itself in terms of its therapeutic value to the students. By the way, you'll hear me sometimes say clients. I'm doing that for the benefit of people who might be listening. I don't use the term client. I use the least clinical language I can, even in trainings with clinical teams. Some children are very savvy and they have been through a lot of clinical interventions, and they're very accustomed to clinical language, therapeutic language, and they're often very resistant to it as well. Or they know how to roll with it, really well in terms of sort of saying what they need to say. So you can do very clinically sophisticated things without sounding like you're doing them. The best therapy is the therapy that the student doesn't know is happening. It is something that they're just kind of accepting as part of their day-to-day life and is going on, and it has the quality of helping them in their life. So everything, all of that happens that's not the therapy session itself is what I'm talking about when I say clinically centered. So a program is not clinically centered if all the clinically, or if all the therapeutic value, the sort of the majority of the therapeutic value is based on what the clinical professionals do directly with the child. But it's the way that a program is designed and the constant training that's going on, wherein all of the staff know how to interact with the students, why they're interacting in a certain way with the students, what is therapeutically valuable for students, what is therapeutically not a really great thing to do with students. I was talking with a therapist many, many years ago. This was the context of a wilderness therapy program. Most of my experience has been in wilderness therapy. And he said, Shayne, it's interesting. I've noticed, I have a child who is on the autism spectrum, and I get a lot of autism spectrum type cases. And I've noticed our staff do really, really well with these kiddos. And I haven't necessarily sat them down and given them particular pointers on how to work with spectrum-y type students and children, but they just don't get wrapped around the axle. These kids don't have good executive functioning. You give them 3 instructions, they're probably only going to sort of remember half of the first one. But our staff are trained to see these children as people and to be patient and kind and seeking after treating these children in such a way that it's demonstrative of showing them respect, the staff showing the child respect. He goes, so, they're not doing what they're being asked to do. Somebody could freak out about that, in a treatment scenario. You're not obeying me. You're not getting with the program. You're disrespecting me as a staff because you're not doing what I'm telling you to do. Well, you could either train staff to understand these subtle nuances of working with spectrum-y kids wherein you can't expect those kind of things, so ratchet back the attitude, or you can teach them to see people as people. So they will naturally work better with autistic spectrum type clients. They'll naturally work better with oppositional defiant type clients. If you get upset with an oppositional kid, the oppositional kid is going to feel, understand, and know that you're upset by what they just did. They're oppositional, so they're going to keep that up. So if your training is such that you understand a relational model which has therapeutic value, you're not going to set off the oppositional kids as much as you otherwise would. You can hold boundaries with them in an out-of-the-box, seeing them as a person-oriented way, and you're going to get farther because they won't be resisting you. Trauma. This model is perfect for trauma because children do all sorts of things based on their trauma background that we won't necessarily understand. We won't understand why they're doing that. So we can get upset with them because they're calling us names, or they're flipping us off, or they're cussing at us, or they're just not answering back. Whatever it is, we can feel disrespected as line staff, or we can understand that to see this person as a person means I need to try to get behind their eyes. Instead of getting them to try to understand me. So it is the overall general training of those in the overall general program that makes a program clinically centered. Then, of course, you have the professional clinical team that is adding everything that they do onto that as well. So these two things together is a clinically centered program, which is an aspect of a relational program, because it's the two pieces together, working it out, understanding that both pieces are just as important one to the other. In a wilderness therapy type experience, it's even more important that the program have the therapeutic value that it ought to have, because the clinicians just simply aren't around as much. And it's not necessarily helpful. It's not a better, more clinically sophisticated program, I'm convinced of this, to just have your staff your line staff who are out there with the kids all the time in a wilderness therapy program be therapists themselves or interns or something like that. Because what we don't want to do is convince a child that they have to have therapists around them all the time, that the way they progress in life is to be therapeutically intervened upon or taught by therapists. Some of the greatest ways people change have nothing to do with the therapists. The therapists, in large part, are there to make sure that the treatment plan is being carried out in a proper way, and then to do what they know how to do best in terms of their one-on-one work, and that's great. But a child going through a program that has only therapists around them, compared to a program that has some therapists and then a whole lot of other sort of people that they're getting therapeutic value from, informs their brain. I can get therapeutic value and I can find ways to grow in terms of my relationships with and my interactions with people in my life, even though they're not therapists. To throw more therapists and more therapy and more therapeutic type stuff into a program without also paying a lot of attention to the program itself in terms of being clinically centered is a marketing move, not a program quality move. I hope I don't upset people by saying that, but in my opinion, that's the truth. Okay, so clinically centered. The two halves, or all of the pieces, the professional clinical part and the whole program, all on board. And it's the program that's powerful, and the clinical team is part of that. Not the clinical stuff is powerful inside of this really big program that they're just like this little piece of. That's not as clinically centered. All right, so family focus. This is number 7 in terms of a relational model for a treatment program. And number 8 is more of a wilderness therapy concept that residential type treatment programs can also implement, but number 8 I would say probably belongs more in the wilderness therapy world, with the hope that residential can at least do it a little bit. So, but I'll get to number 8 in a second. Family focus. Okay, so I just got through talking about, in terms of the previous 6 aspects, about this idea of all of your line staff, therapists, everybody seeing the students as people and working with them in a relational way. So, and the effectiveness of that, efficacy of running a program like that, a relational program through and through. So, if you were focused on families and helping families, you would suppose that the bulk of what you're offering to families or trying to help families understand or trying to help families apply is the same thing. Helping moms and dads, grandparents, siblings see the identified patient as a person. And for the identified patient, the student that's in the program, to see their parents as people. Everybody in their lives, the authority figures in their lives as people as well. So to help the relationship between the identified client, like I said, I call them students, and their family. This is a family focus. You could sit families down and talk all day long, 3 days all day long, about parenting skills. And in my opinion, you're not going to get very far. That is not a family-focused experience. That is a training people to do certain things experience. So it's more of a how to behave with each other focus as opposed to a family focus. So to help a dad see themselves as a person, even though they have a background of addiction. See a mom see herself as a person, even though she has a background of depression. And to let things like guilt not dictate how they parent, or things like fear dictate how they parent, but to address those pieces, their own way of being, which then helps them interact with their child in a completely different way, whether it be an adolescent child or a young adult child. A lot of us as parents have insecurities and angst and prejudices and fears and problems and judgmentalisms and I don't know if I said insecurities. Anyway, we have personal stuff, and that is what dictates how we have been treating our child. And by the way, here's another thing. We could be quite healthy as parents, and our child goes through something that is just unbelievable traumatic, and no parent, as great as they are necessarily equipped to handle something like that. That's what treatment programs are for. But even in that context, how can I see this person who's behaving in these very inappropriate ways as a person, coming from me as a parent? How can I see my child more as a person? Even though I haven't necessarily been seeing them as an object, but with their behavior that's just been so difficult to deal with, maybe I've eased off into being upset more than I need to, or have hurt feelings more than I need to, and my child has felt that, and I don't know how to necessarily navigate how I feel. Well, a family-focused program would focus more on the family relationships than anything else. They would seek to help the family understand what a relational model is, even if you're speaking about a family unit, as opposed to a behavioral model, which is get my child to behave the way that they ought to, regardless of what their actual clinical, deep-seated personal difficulties are. So, relational program is going to treat how they work with families in a family-focused way as opposed to a behavioral unit way. All right. So, lastly, and I guess what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the residential piece. This is coming from a wilderness type person. So, society is in most of the world is lost. It begins to become more and more lost to the degree that we get disconnected to what is most real and what is most simple and what is most genuine. Social media is not simple or genuine. Playing too much computer games is certainly not simple. It's very difficult to be genuine in because everybody is somebody that they're not, which is also true in social media. Surfing around on the internet incessantly is not being connected with people necessarily, or with the world as it really is. And when I say the world as it really is, what I'm trying to explain here is that not necessarily people, I'm going to talk about the world now. So I can walk down a concrete street and everything around me is man-made, person-made. And that gives me a certain kind of, that influences me in a certain way. I can also go to a park, go to a tree, go to grass, go to where animals are, perhaps, and hang out simply with nature. Now, residential programs can do that. Families can do that. Why is that such a big deal? Why am I bringing this up? That part of a relational program would involve nature. Well, because the rest of the things to relate to, besides human to human, is human to all the other live things, the plant and the animal kingdom, and sort of in an odd way, everything else as well. A mountain range, for example. So I can begin to sense the real when I get in it. And some of the ways that I can get in it is go for a walk, in nature. Go to a wilderness therapy program. Residential programs can have an outdoor component. A lot of them do. A lot of them really understand this idea well. And so they'll go out on weekend excursions. A lot of them are doing these sorts of things because they know how heavily influenced a lot of their clients have been coming from wilderness therapy. So they will do little wilderness jaunts themselves to kind of try to keep a hold of that idea. It's important. Humans out there listening to me, going to nature and experiencing nature and trying to be in it is important. These are anecdotal stories, but there was a hospital, I believe it was in Philadelphia, 100 and some odd years ago, and a part of it burnt down. And so they had to put a lot of the patients, medical type patients, I believe there may have been some psychological type things as well, I don't remember. Anyway, they were outside in tents. The people who were outside got better faster than the people who were inside. And everybody's like, what the heck is going on? That sort of was one of the first sort of spurring moments of the development of wilderness therapy as it is today, in terms of people understanding that something's going on when people go to the wilderness. It's been recognized that psychiatric patients do better if they can look out the window and see nature. So people have even painted neighboring buildings with little birds and with vines and whatnot. And it has been demonstrated to show a positive effect more so than if those things aren't painted. So even the idea that they're looking at a representation of nature is a very positive thing. What can most affect us in simple ways comes from our relationships with humans and comes from our relationships with other live things. The best way to get to live things is to do something outdoors and in nature. Get away, get to the mountains. I've got a few quotes that I would like to share as part of this episode on this subject. So, the wilderness holds answers to questions man has not yet learned how to ask. Nancy Newhall said that. The great, fresh, unblighted, unredeemed wilderness, the galling harness of civilization drops off, and the wounds heal ere we are aware. John Muir. In the wilderness I find something more dear and connate than in the streets or villages. In the woods we return to reason and faith. Ralph Waldo Emerson. How great are the advantages of solitude. How sublime is the silence of nature's ever-active energies. There is something in the very name of wilderness which charms the ear and soothes the spirit of man. Whenever the light of civilization faces upon you with a blighting power, go to the wilderness. The wilderness will take hold of you. You will soon behold all with a peaceful soul. Estwick Evans. Our lives need the relief of where the pine flourishes and the jay still screams. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. Henry David Thoreau. Now I see the secret of making the best person. It is to grow in the open air and to eat and sleep with the earth. Walt Whitman. The wilderness is a place of rest. The rest comes in the isolation from distractions, in the slowing of the daily centrifugal forces that keep us off balance. David Douglas. Wilderness settles peace on the soul because it needs no help. It is beyond human contrivance. Wilderness is a metaphor for unlimited opportunity. E. O. Wilson. This one kind of gets me more than all the others, this last one. The best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quiet, alone with the heavens and nature. I firmly believe that nature brings solace in all troubles. Anne Frank. I cannot adequately describe the importance of human beings getting connected with nature. I have spent over 1,400 days and nights in the wilderness, all with troubled young people. To watch their eyes change, not because of their therapist, not because of me as their staff, but just because they are in that wondrous place. I just don't have the words for it. I can't describe it. But I've seen it thousands of times. So a relational model will be one that helps the students be relational to all live things and to understand that. This is very evident when people talk about canine therapy, equine therapy. I sometimes use the term therapy human. People talk about therapy dogs, therapy horses, a lot of things that comes from nature, and humans can almost imitate that. What can nature do that a human can sort of get on board with? What does nature do that a human can get on board with that helps them be more therapeutic as a human? If you walk up to a juniper tree and yell at it, it won't yell back. If you cut its branch off, it won't hit you with the other branch. It also won't keep shade. It won't put its branches down so that you won't get shade from it. It will still continue to shade you. In effect, a juniper tree is unoffendable, regardless of what we do to it. So a student in a program could yell at us, try to demean us, hurt our feelings, threaten us, disobey us, not cooperate, all the sorts of things that you would maybe even consequence them for. Or we can be unoffended like a juniper tree. They figure it out. They really do, especially in wilderness therapy. They figure out that these instructors around them are being kind of like the nature around them. And it becomes very powerful. So in wilderness therapy, the more wildernessy the wilderness therapy is, the better the wilderness program is going to be, in my opinion. So the 8th thing is called an actual wilderness experience. So let me summarize all of them. Relational treatment model should be relationship driven above all else, non-punitive, non-consequencing, should engage agency, should acknowledge internal change, should be clinically centered in the way I described, not have a level system, have a family focus in the way I described, and be an actual wilderness experience. It's weird to me when programs say they're a wilderness therapy program and they're kind of not. And I'll leave that for people to explore, study wilderness therapy yourself. But I believe in the efficacy of the wilderness as a powerful engine in terms of helping people change. More so than the line instructors, more so than the therapists, the wilderness will do its job. And to the degree that we all get, as practitioners, get on board with what the wilderness can do in wilderness therapy settings, the better off that program is going to be. So the less often you can come back out of wilderness and get in buildings, the less often you get in vehicles, the less often you listen to modern music, the less often you get online, the less often you do modern stuff, the better your wilderness therapy program is going to be, in my opinion. And if you're a parent out there looking for a wilderness therapy program, well, that's still my opinion. Look for the most wildernessy wilderness programs that also have those other components in place. You can't just have the wildernessy stuff. Although this whole industry, the whole industry of wilderness therapy was born because of just the wilderness and its influence. That's how it came to be. It can either be added to in good ways that complement the wilderness experience, or it can be essentially watered down or even polluted. So there you go. I emphasize a little bit more about the wilderness therapy aspect of it in terms of a relational model, but I covered, for the most part, the first 7 pieces are important 7 pieces for any relational model in any treatment setting. So thank you for listening. I will cover and have covered some of these more specifically in their own episodes, so look at my other episodes. Please like my episodes. Please comment. It's really helpful if you comment. Kind of helpful to me if you comment. And feel free to start a dialogue with me in the comments if you have any questions or anything like that. And until next time, contemplate a relational model as it pertains to you in your life. Is your life a relational model with all of those around you? Contemplate that for a while. Woo, that's kind of a biggie. Until next time.